Welcome, Western Standard viewers. We are honored today to have with us the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith.
Hi, Nigel. Nice to be here.
Well, it must feel good to be back on the Western Standard broadcast network.
Well, it's good talking to you. You and I have had long conversations about what we're about to talk about today, so I'm looking forward to it.
Well, so am I, actually, and I wasn't going to presume and brag, but since you mentioned it, yes, there is a considerable similarity between what I see in the documents before me and some of the conversations that took place in the corridor on the editorial board at the Calgary Herald. You've changed a bit, but not on fundamentals.
You may remember that I met you after I'd done a turn at the Fraser Institute, as well as I also did a turn as a property rights advocate with the Canadian Property Rights Research Institute. So some of the things that we're implementing today, I've been thinking about and wanting to do for almost 30 years.
That is one of the things about today's generation of conservative politicians that a lot of people overlook. But that is the consistency of thought and principle. The methods improve and the articulation improves, but the basic ideas are the same. So let me ask you about the Alberta Bill of Rights. You want to bring in amendments and strengthen it. One might say, what's wrong with it? What do you want to fix?
We have to remember a little bit about our heritage of drafting bills of rights. I think that the very first one goes back to Diefenbaker in 1960, when he came up with the Canadian Bill of Rights. And then Lougheed followed very shortly after that in 1972 with the Alberta Bill of Rights. And 10 years later was the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so I would say that conservative thinkers, conservative policymakers have always really led on the discussion of identifying the rights that need to be protected. And some of this, I suppose, is that we have now recognized that there, with the passage of time, are some areas where it's not very clear, and we want to make absolutely certain that we're not only leading the discussion as a province, hopefully have some influence on some of our neighbors, hopefully have some influence on the federal government, but also chart a very clear understanding about what our values are as Albertans. And I think that's what the Alberta Bill of Rights does.
So you mentioned the Diefenbaker Bill of Rights. That, of course, only applied to the relationships between citizens and the government. It was not as all-embracing as the later human rights legislation that came along. When we're talking about the Alberta Bill of Rights, are we talking about the government only, or are we talking about a much wider spectrum of interest?
Well, you're right. I mean, that's the Alberta Bill of Rights charts out what a citizen's relationship is with their provincial governments. As you know, I'm a constitutionalist too, so I pay very close attention to what our powers are under the Constitution versus the federal government. But I would say that there are areas where we absolutely need to have some clarity and some strength. And that's part of the reason why I think the amendments that we're putting forward will create that clarity, because oftentimes it is the provincial level of government which can also be the ones that are conducting themselves or passing bills in a way that doesn't live up to this high standard. I think we saw that during COVID, that a lot of the policies that impacted on people's choices actually started at the provincial level. And I think the federal government followed the lead of the provinces. So if we can create a new understanding that government is going to respect the individual rights of its citizens and enshrine that with more robust language in our Bill of Rights, I think that could have a major influence on the country.
Yes, it would, but I would refer you to September 2021, when the federal government decided that any individual who worked in government or for a federally regulated industry had to receive the vaccine. Now, I know much of this is to do with the medical protection of Albertans, but here's a very particular case where the order was given, get the vaccine. If not, you can't work. Now, that was from the feds. That would seem to put the Alberta Bill of Rights in direct opposition to an order of the federal government. How does that get resolved?
Well, we have the authority over provincially regulated workplaces, which is most of them. And so what we would do is we would make sure that our provincially regulated workplaces would have that full freedom. And I think by making the statement that Alberta is not going to just go along with whatever edicts the federal government brings down, I think that they would be a lot more judicious in coming through with any type of policy like that again. But we have to start somewhere. And I believe we've got to start by creating an environment for freedom in our province, hopefully seeing other provinces do the same, and then ultimately having an impact on the federal level.
Well, certainly we wouldn't want perfection to be the enemy of the good. So we do indeed start at the provincial level, as you say, and yet there is that thing that has to be worked out as the relationship between this set of guarantees and those offered by the federal government. Am I reading this correctly or not?
Well, look, I mean, I do try to make sure that I ask the federal government to stay out of our lane. And so I do try to make sure that I'm staying in my own lane. And I think we all know that when the provincial government tries to pass laws in areas of federal jurisdiction or attempts to pass laws to put reins on the federal government, they've used their power of disallowance. Disallowance is a power that the federal government has under the Constitution to strike down provincial laws. They used it 112 times, including several times against Alberta. So I'm not inclined to want to put forward a piece of legislation that the federal government would be able to reject. So I'm going to stay in our lane on this one and just really have the moral high ground, saying this is how we conduct ourselves in Alberta. And I would hope that others will follow suit.
If you stay in your lane, you certainly will have the moral high ground. Thinking of pipeline legislation here now. Look, I'd like you to blue sky a little about what the wider implications of this revamping, or I wouldn't even call it revamping. It seems to be judicious modifications. We don't know what you're going to put forward. Obviously, you know, the legislation will be announced when it's announced. You made a lot about the right to refuse medical treatment that you didn't want. Is that going to fly with Albertans, do you think?
Well, look, I mean, I think we all had a pretty tough time during COVID. People lost their jobs. People weren't allowed to go into restaurants. People weren't allowed to go see their kids' hockey game. People weren't allowed to go to their places of worship. People weren't allowed to travel. And I don't think we want to see that again. I think when people look in the rearview mirror and look at how they want their government to treat them as private free citizens, I think they want some guarantee that if we do get into that situation again, there's going to be more focused protection for the most vulnerable, as opposed to blanket bans that take away people's rights. And this was something that Preston Manning looked into when I asked him to review our COVID response and give us some recommendations. And his recommendations were that we have a modification to the Alberta Bill of Rights to give more robust protection to an individual's right to either accept or refuse a medical treatment. As long as they're of sound mind, they should have the ability to say, no, thank you. I've made my own choices on that, and we should be respecting that right. So I think that with the passage of time, I think more and more people have begun to realize just how vitally important it is to be able to have that freedom to say no.
So you may recall that in the COVID years, there was a net out migration from California that was a highly restrictive state. People went, I think the numbers are something like 700,000. I mean, the joke was that you couldn't get a U-Haul in California, but you could get a lot in Texas, and you could get as many as you wanted in Florida. People got out when they didn't like the way the system was being run. And I wonder if you would make the case that beyond the matter of mandatory vaccination and the right to refuse it, there is actually a larger market for people who like a free or a relatively free political entity. Better to be in Texas than in California, better to be in Florida than in New York, better to be in Alberta than any other place in Canada. Is there an element of that thinking in enlarging or am I getting too into the weeds here?
I think that you've identified something very important. You have to remember, we had 13 quarters of outmigration from our province in the years between 2015 and 2019. Then, of course, we had COVID and no one was moving anywhere. And so we had the CBC writing stories about how no one wanted to be in Alberta. And yet we knew that with the oil and gas prices turning around, we needed to have more people come here to help us fill the job vacancies. I don't know that we expected quite as many people to come here as they did in 2023, but I think there was a lot of factors. There was the fact was that we were the first jurisdiction to firmly put COVID restrictions behind us. We banned mask mandates in schools. We banned mask mandates in hospitals. We banned the discrimination against healthcare workers by saying vaccination status should not determine whether you get to keep your job as a healthcare worker. And I think it was because we were the first to go firmly down the freedom track. I think that's part of the reason why people move here. I know whenever I travel around the province and go to my town halls, and I do a lot of that, I have people who come here, who come up to me from British Columbia, from Ontario, saying that that's one of the reasons why they chose to come here. So I think there is something to that if we have a very strong, firm statement that we believe in limited government, and we believe that government should follow certain rules, and that people, and that they should respect the rights of their citizenry, I think people will continue to want to come to Alberta. We can be that little bastion of liberty when others might be turning a different direction.
That's one aspect of an expanded Bill of Rights the other, I wonder whether you're going to, what are your feelings about legislation that would enrich the right of a homeowner to stand his ground when he's faced with a home invasion? I'm thinking of some incidents that have taken place over the last few years in which people who live in rural areas where the police response time is slow have actually been attacked. They have had intruders on their property, and they have found themselves in more trouble than the intruders. A lot of people see that as fundamentally unjust. In fact, I think there's a word for it, the castle doctrine, the idea that your home is your castle. Do you want this expanded Bill of Rights to look at that area as well?
Well, look, I mean, there's a lot of area of law that falls under the criminal code, and the decision that our constitutional drafters made in our context was that criminal code provisions are federal jurisdiction, not provincial jurisdiction. And so that's why there's a little bit of a difference between Canada and the United States. In the United States, that criminal law power is at the state level. That's why you can see very different policies play out in criminal law in California, for instance, versus Texas, because there is a lot more latitude on the part of the governor and the elected judges and the elected crown attorneys to be able to chart a different course. We don't have that structure in Canada. I know some people are frustrated by that, but there are certain things that I think require a change in federal government if you want a different outcome. The things that we do advocate for is because we also are jointly responsible for property. We're jointly responsible for policing, jointly responsible for administration of justice, and we also have the right to protect property and civil rights. That's a provincial area of jurisdiction. So we would be looking at ways to be able to address public safety through a few measures. Number one, we've advocated to the federal government they stop their catch and release program. That's part of the reason why so many people are continuing to be victimized by criminals who are constant repeat offenders. We have also created a role for the justice of the peace. Those are the individuals we appoint so that individuals go before them for a bail hearing, and hopefully the really bad guys are going to be kept behind bars. We have also expanded our role for our provincial sheriffs to do a fugitive apprehension program, which has been very successful. So successful, we've just rolled it out in Calgary as well, so that we can catch the bad guys and make sure that they do stay behind bars. I would hope that we would get to a point where our policing function and our administration of justice is so trustworthy that people wouldn't feel like they had to take matters into their own hands. So that's one part that we're looking at. But we do know that we can do more to protect the rights of law-abiding firearms owners, and we do know that we can do more to protect property rights. And those are two other major elements of the amendments that we're bringing forward in the Bill of Rights.
Well, talk to us a little bit about the firearms owners. Obviously, that's a matter of huge concern in Alberta.
Yeah. Well, I think people, and maybe I'm not sure why it was ever neglected in the discussion of previous bills of rights. Maybe it was because it was such a given that our hunters and our ranchers and our farmers and our sport shooters had such legacy rights to be able to legally own firearms and use them responsibly, that no one could imagine a future government trying to take away those rights. But sure enough, I think throughout the 90s and 2000s and even today, we continue to see governments attack the right of lawful firearms owners to be able to use, enjoy, and own their firearms. So that's one of the provisions that we'll be putting into the Bill of Rights, is just recognizing that right, hopefully as a bit of a shield against the federal government. I mean, this is where constitutional rights end up bumping up against each other. We believe we've got the right to protect the private property rights of our citizens. The federal government has been taking aggressive action to make legal firearms owners criminals just by the stroke of a pen. And I'm prepared to put a line in the sand and fight that out in the courts, because I think that what the federal government should be focused on is the criminal use of firearms. They should be focused on gun smuggling. They should be focusing on gangs. They should be focusing on the commission of a crime using a firearm. They should not be going after the law-abiding citizens. Many Albertans are law-abiding firearms owners. So that's one of the reasons why we're putting that in the legislation too.
Good to hear that. I heard an astonishing thing on Fox News a week ago that that firearms owners and Christians tend not to vote. I couldn't think of a constituency more that needs to vote more than firearms owners, especially here in Alberta, where we have an active threat from the federal government.
I think that sometimes people get demoralized when they see that it doesn't matter what political stripe a party wears. If they're worried that their rights are not going to be protected, I think that can result in some apathy. And I don't want people to feel apathetic. I want people to feel like engaging in the political process matters, and giving feedback to politicians matters. And I think conservative politicians should govern as conservatives, and conservatives believe in the rights of law-abiding firearms owners not to be targeted by their federal government in the way that we've seen happen in the past. So that's part of the reason why we've got that in there.
Good. Excellent. I heard you speak recently on the nature of Albertan identity.
Mm-hmm.
And you made the comment that there are some people in Alberta whose families go back, and I believe you said 7 generations. Sounded like you had somebody in mind. Been here 7 generations and they still don't get it. Whereas there are recent arrivals in Alberta who, once they're 6 months, they get what Alberta is about. Could you just repeat what it is that Alberta is about? And then I got a follow-up for you on that.
I think so. I was being interviewed by somebody and they posed it that way to me, and I didn't disagree with the way that they posed it. But I can tell you what I think Alberta is about. And I talk about it in every group that I go before. I talk about the values that we have. It starts with freedom, support of family, support of faith groups and community, and I'll talk about why this construct is in my mind in a moment. Free enterprise and philanthropy. And part of what grows healthy individuals is having strong families. Part of what creates strong communities is when something happens in an environment and people need support, and they can go to their faith community, or they can go to the broader community to be able to get assistance. Free enterprise is one of the ways that we're able to enjoy such a high quality of life and a high standard of living, is because we give people the freedom to be entrepreneurs and innovators. And then oftentimes what I see is that when somebody's successful, they give back to the community. We have some of the greatest philanthropists in our community, and we honor many of them through things like the Alberta Order of Excellence. And so I would say anyone who comes to this province is likely coming here because we value those things so much. There was a woman who was at one of the events I went to from Fairness Alberta from a few years back. Bill Buick used to run that group. And she ended up giving $10,000 on site. And she was a woman of color. And I went up to her afterwards. I said, well, why do you feel so strongly about this group? And she'd said, I have worked everywhere around the world. And the place where I have felt most valued for my contribution and merit is Alberta. People don't care the color of your skin, don't care that I'm a woman, don't care where I came from. They just care what I can add, what I can do. And that's why I value this place so much. And so I would say that is the consistent thing that I hear when I go across the province, is that we honor each individual for who they are, want to provide the greatest support that we can to them to be able to build out strong families and strong communities and be able to live their dreams here. And I think that's why people come here. I think I would say that that's also one of the reasons why we have a public consensus about having such a diverse society. And it's because people leave their historic conflicts behind and they come here to create a new life. And that's what we want to be able to offer to anyone who comes to Alberta, is the chance to put behind some of the hatreds and conflicts and just be able to make a wonderful life for themselves and their families.
Well, I think it's that matter of the community consensus that I want to take you to. In your remarks that have just been broadcast, you said the following, and I know I've known you for a long time, as you said at the beginning of the episode. So I know that these are your real feelings. That you want a less intrusive government, and that's a very deeply held conviction of yours. So when you talk in your statement about the rights and freedoms that are central to our identity as Albertans, I know that's your heart. So look,
I've been advocating for it for a long time. I must
you
tell
certainly
you,
have.
one other area, of course, is that as you know, since I started off as a property rights advocate, one thing that was always missing from our various statements on property, like it's completely absent in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It exists in the Bills of Rights, but it doesn't enshrine a concept of just compensation. It talks about being able to take property with due process of the law. Well, that just means you can pass a law saying we're taking your property. I always felt that to be inadequate. And so the notion of fair compensation is also important because it's a way of ensuring less intrusive government. If government is going to have to pay full, fair, timely market compensation for interfering in your ability to own and use your property, then they're going to be less interfering. That's the reason why those are a companion, is that we do, I think in Alberta, people look to themselves and their family and their communities first for help. And they look at government as a last resort, not a first resort. And I think government should look at it the same way. They should be very light-handed in interfering in an individual's personal affairs and individual freedoms. And I think that's what charting some of these areas out in a Bill of Rights is meant to do.
I guess that's the point that I'm coming to. That's what you think. That's what I think. That's what a tremendous number of people in Alberta do think. But I want you to take back to the COVID era, and you're pulling up at a red light. This is before you got to, when you still had to drive your own car, and you look, and there's somebody in the next vehicle. They're in their car. They're on their own, and they've got the mask on. There are people in Alberta who I have to wonder whether they share that same emotional affection for freedom as you do. And that when you speak of the rights and freedoms that are central to our identity as Albertans, they're not necessarily feeling that sense of identity with those things. So do you think that you have the mass support needed to put through strong amendments to Alberta's Bill of Rights?
Well, I guess we'll see the reaction. I mean, I've always felt like Alberta's a bit of a special place. When you look at our history, we do consistently, with some very minor exceptions, tend to vote for conservatives at the federal level. We tend to vote for conservatives at the provincial level, and we do tend, when we do have popular conservative leaders, to have them win not just a plurality, but a majority of the vote. And so I would say you never get 100% of the people agreeing with you 100% of the time in any society, in any jurisdiction. But Alberta, I think, is slightly more conservative than the rest of Canada. And I think there's a lot of things that stem from that. I think you do end up seeing a lot more innovation here. You do end up seeing people coming here because of that. You do end up seeing, I think, the economic successes that we have had. I think that the respect that we have for one another, and the fact that we have less conflict, it seems, here on a number of issues. All of those suggest to me that there is something a bit unique about the Alberta culture and character. And I'll find out a little bit more about what the public consensus is when these amendments have had a chance to be introduced. But I can tell you, I have heard from hundreds, if not thousands, of Albertans over the many years of advocating on these issues. And I feel pretty confident that the majority of Albertans are going to be with us.
Premier, when do you think we're going to see the draft legislation?
I can tell you that we go into the legislature on October 28th. And October 28th is normally private members' business. And then we have government business that'll be on the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And so I would imagine that if the finishing touches have been put on it by our Legislative Review Committee, it may be in that first week back in the legislature.
Last question then, Madam Premier. You have your Sovereignty Act and you have an amended Bill of Rights. These are foundation stones of the Smith legacy, or is there something else that you value even more?
Oh, well, yeah, I can tell you, I'm so gratified to see that I've got a united caucus and some really talented cabinet ministers and a strong party, and people who are participating in our policy process to make sure that we're having that check, that we're heading in the right direction. So we have been here for a couple of years. We've got a few more years to go before the next election. But I believe in bold government. I believe that when we identify problems, we've got to identify a solution and we've got to move quickly to solve it. So we won't be resting on our laurels for the next 3 years. So you may have to ask me in 3 years' time whether or not we managed to get everything done that we intended to.
They said to me that Danielle Smith is having altogether too much fun as Premier of the province. I hope you continue to have fun for 2 more terms. Madam Premier, thank you for this. On behalf of the Western Standard, we thank you. And for the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.